A whio mai tala mai ao, ma alo le soifo, ma lange mama. Welcome everyone. My name is Damon Salesa. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor here at the University of Auckland, and it's my honour to chair this next session, which is picking up from the session before last and reflecting on the new trade environment implications for Aotearoa New Zealand. We've had a few adjustments to the panel since we printed. So the panel we're welcoming today, a wonderful panel indeed, is a little different to that on the program and the app. Unfortunately, Mitchell Pham and Dr. Colin Tukuitonga were unable to make it today. Both of them were unwell. And so we've been able to offer more time to our wonderful guests, and we've also been very lucky to welcome Pamela Ford. So what we're going to do for this session is to offer the opportunity for each of our panelists to offer an opening sort of set of remarks in the order that they're sitting at the table, on the stage, sorry. And Jennifer said that if I could channel Colin at some point, I get to weigh in as well. I think the thing that should all strike us is where we're sitting, both in the larger context of sitting in Auckland, the world's largest Polynesian city, and the particular context, sitting in this building, one of the two most distinctive buildings on our campus, the Whale Pacifica. I know we're all welcomed here, but when you sit in this building, you make no mistakes about where you're sitting in the Moana, and that is going to feed very strongly into the themes of today. I thought, just as a provocation and to frame consistently with the building in which we sit, is to note that in 9 days, a certain trade agreement comes into force. Which one? Thank you, the young MFATers got it. Not the old MFATers who negotiated it, who forgot. And that, of course, puts the whole business of New Zealand's trade in a different context. We tend to think of New Zealand as a small player in large trade agreements, but actually many times it's a large player in equally large trade agreements. So we welcome you back to the Whale and to the Moana, and we particularly welcome our panellists. So first up, we will have Rachel Tauleilei, who is Ngāti Raukaua, ki Tonga, Ngāti Rārua. Most of you will know all about her. She's CEO of Kono, a Maori-owned top 100 New Zealand food and beverage company, which farms in both the land and sea, and exports to over 25 countries. She's also has been the founder of the sustainable seafood company Yellow Brick Road, and she was previously New Zealand's Trade Commissioner in Los Angeles, at one point a young MFATer who knew the dates of agreements. She has won many awards. The one I'll choose to note, for obvious reasons, is she was Māori Woman Business Leader at the University of Auckland Māori Business Awards. So with that, I'll hand over to Rachel.
Inga mana, inga reo, inga maunga whakehi, tēnā koutou katoa, tēnei te mihi mai o hā kia koutou katoa I tēnei rā. I rangatira, tēnā koe. Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. And it is my first time in the whale. When I walked in, I said to somebody, "Where's the whale?" And they were like, "Oh, do you mean the whare?" And I was like, "No, I mean the whale." But I just got stereotyped on my way in. But fantastic to be here today. It's 2 days worth of amazing conversation about a number of things that I hold really dear to my heart, quite specifically inclusion, sustainability and trade. So they're central to what I do, they're central to me as a person, and really they're among the things that get me out of bed every morning and into my role as CEO of Kono, as we referenced. I think as well, you could fairly say that they're fundamental to the role that I took on very recently. Well, I actually said yes to it back in the end of, 2020? It must have been the end of 2018, to take on the role as a member of APEC, the APEC Business Advisory Council. And then a couple of weeks ago, I picked up, or was formally given, the role of chair for APEC 2021, which has been a roller coaster, hasn't it, Stephen? It's been a baptism of fire over the last year because it has already been acknowledged, not been a year like any other, but it's been fascinating and a real privilege and a pleasure to have such an astute audience here today, especially the young MFATers. whereas in our organisation we call them Yopos. So you can take that one too. So I've been asked to speak about the new trade environment and the implications for Aotearoa, a weighty topic and certainly one that serves for great discussion. And I thought that I might start my few minutes today with a story. And that story is of a heke, which is a migration. And my own ancestors and my cousin over here, Honi McGregor, who you'll be hearing from tomorrow, our ancestors in the 1820s, 1830s made their way from Kawhia in the North Island here, through to northern Taranaki, down through to the Kapiti Coast, Wellington, and then they pushed across over into Marlborough and then over into Nelson, Golden Bay and Tasman Bay. And they did this in great waves of migration where they picked up families along the way, they dropped off families who decided they wanted to be near the maunga and not by beautiful Kaititere, it's fine. But we got to the top of the South Island in around the 1820s, 1830s, and that became our tūranga waiwai, the place that we set our feet, the place that we go to empower ourselves to move forward, and the place that really makes sense for us. So we were the original landowners, the original providors, and we fed, clothed, traded from our forests and from our rivers and from our moana and from our gardens. And today, we even take that forward, and it's what we do today, we just do it in a modern way. So we're still purveyors of fine food and beverages that's taken from the land and the waters that our tupuna knew and that who have given us the legacy and the responsibility to carry forward. But we do it in a way that celebrates who we are as people. We do it in a modern way, and as has been mentioned, we export beautifully Maori branded products to 20, 30, 40 countries sometimes around the world. So we draw our inspiration from kono, that's the name of our company. A kono is a woven basket. You would place into that basket your best food products for your most esteemed guest, really bringing to life the spirit of manaaki. We aspire to be the best Indigenous food and beverage company in the world, and that's a best for us. It's being authentic versions of ourselves as we do that. We export wine and cider and seafood and fruit and natural fruit bars, and our guiding principle is love for the land, respect for the sea. Our purpose is drawn from Te Pai Tawhiti, our 500-year plan, and you might hear more about that tomorrow from Johnny. And our purpose is to preserve and enhance our taonga, our treasures, for the benefit of present and future generations. And we want to create something for our community, our families, our staff, our customers, our associates, everyone that we touch. We're trying to create something that people can be proud of and that they can benefit from. So sustainability, given that our natural resources are in fact our tupuna, they are central to everything that we do, and that includes fishing. So fishing is, of course, a source of economic and cultural wealth for Māori, and at Kono we use science-based catch plans, as does everyone in the commercial industry, and sustainable aquaculture approaches so that we can meet demand without destroying our ecosystem. Our wine and fruit is produced to the highest standards of sustainability and innovation, and it's what allows us to get that premium in the market. It's the practices and it's the story that we share when we invite people through into a little glimpse of Te Ao Māori. So it's about inclusion, it's about sustainability, and it's categorically about trade. So it gives me huge pleasure, great pleasure, to be able to bring those values of my actual day job into my role as the chair of APEC for 2021. When we're hosting APEC next year, we genuinely have an opportunity to shape our well-being and the well-being of not only the Asia-Pacific businesses, but communities around our region for years to come. And in our year of 2021, our theme is people, place, and prosperity, or as we like to think of it, tangata, taiao, me te taurekura. And two of our key priorities, or one of them actually, let's start with the first priority, people. That's really for me at the heart of our agenda. The well-being of people, their hopes and aspirations for a future beyond COVID, not ignoring the fact that we're very much in the thick of COVID, but it's thinking about beyond COVID. And two of the key priorities in our people space are greater inclusion for women and Indigenous people, and really trying to find other ways to continue to include and build the capabilities of our small businesses around the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, questions of inclusion are central to the new trade environment and the title that we've been given today. And in the last few years, the world has increasingly recognised that it's not enough to just grow the pie, and I believe that we had a conversation about that this morning or earlier this afternoon. Aggregate gains to the global economy or our national economies are necessary, but it is certainly not sufficient to create the kinds of societies that we want to live in. We must go further to make sure that every single person has a seat at the table. In the words of the Putrajaya, I knew I'd stumble in this one. I've literally said this word 1,000 times this week. Putrajaya vision. I asked for $1 every time I said it, actually. I'd be loaded this week. In the words of the Putrajaya vision, which was signed by the APEC economic leaders, including our own Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, we're seeking an open, dynamic, resilient, peaceful Asia-Pacific community for the prosperity of all people and all generations. So we have a saying where Johnny and I are from, and is it, are you being a good ancestor? It's a question that we ask ourselves every day. Are you being a good ancestor? And I'm delighted to see that that ethos is writ large in the APEC world too. I'm particularly excited for your day tomorrow, but I'm particularly excited to see what we can do to bring Indigenous economic development to the forefront of the APEC agenda. We can work with partners in the coming year from the region, including partners in economies such as Peru, Chile, Chinese Taipei, Canada, Australia, and many others. I want to see us unlock some of the potential of Māori business and communities for Kono and other food and beverage producers, along with our dynamic digital firms, tourism and education, technology companies, and so many more that make up our Māori economy. And like a lot of Indigenous economies around the world, the Māori economy is a developing one, within which one that is already developed. But that status should categorically not constrain how we think about Indigenous economies, because they are dial movers. The Māori economy is developing at a faster rate than our own national economy. So developing is not underdeveloped. Developing is a sign of innovation and resilience and regeneration. So I do want to see the profile of Indigenous people raised, and really think about how we can accelerate the empowerment of our Indigenous entrepreneurs, our businesses, and our communities. And it's not altogether easy to get your arm around or hands around the shape of the problem or exactly what's needed to address it. Like many of the issues in this new trade environment, it's relatively uncharted territory, but we've made a really good start given all of the things that have been taking place. So far in the last few months, we've created a report on the ecosystem of the Māori economy. We will continue to update that as, it's actually a living document, let's call it. We've got an alternate member proposal in the works so that we can broaden the bench strength of Māori in this space. We are developing a rangatahi program. It used to be when our elders, the opposite of our yopros, used to go along to marae meetings, they would always have young people with them in a ride-along style. And so I don't really want to put myself deeply into the fire category, but since I'm hanging out in that space, we're finding young people to take with us. We're working really closely with APEC on their Māori Success Program, and you might hear more about that tomorrow. And I've also convened a group called Kahui Arahi, who are 6 or 7 really amazing Māori minds who we can call them formally friends of mine, because I've managed to wangle them into this group to provide me with support and advice in a way, in all seriousness, that we would do things ordinarily, which is to say that we're not an individual people, we're a collective people, and so to have that collective thought is going to be, I think, very much a part of our conversation. So I'm eager to see how far we can push that mahi, because it is only one single tiny strain of what's a very complex and full work program. But back to the 3 pillars. Our closely related to people, of course, is our place, our taiao. And not to put too fine a point on it, but our house is burning. And I'm sure that some of you saw the media reports about Australia and their 40-degree temperatures last week. And this is only the 2nd day, I think, of the summer. So you certainly can't negate that we're in dire straits in a climatic sense. And despite a congested political and economic context, we really have the opportunity to show great leadership within Asia-Pacific business community in addressing and mitigating climate change and building a low-carbon future together. We have a great member of our APEC team, Malcolm Johns from Christchurch Airport, and he is an ardent climate change, I would say a participant in the conversation, and he'll be leading a lot of those conversations. Allied to that effort, we also have to consider the development of renewable energy and levelling the playing field for environmentally responsible goods and services, and build a trade-friendly and digitally enabled sustainable food system. And of course, because we are at a trade conference today, I cannot move on without mentioning the moral imperative to eliminate environmentally harmful subsidies, including those blighting fishing, agriculture, and fossil fuel use. So as businesses, or our business certainly, we know a lot about the creation of value over time. And this value is what gives rise to economic and social progress and brings me to our third pillar, prosperity, or taurekura. In 2021, as we contemplate really COVID's body blows to our region's economies, we need to think more purposefully than ever about what is needed to successfully and seamlessly do business in the APEC region. Successful business is underpinned, as you know, by trade rules, effective trade rules at that, by processes, by negotiations which reduce barriers over time, and an enabling environment for innovation, especially in our digital space. Today, our businesses are constrained by the pandemic, but we need to look to tomorrow and the ways in which our economies can be rebuilt and revitalised. So we will be focusing, as we have in years past through APEC, on the WTO, ensuring that it is strong and relevant, on building the free trade area of Asia Pacific, on unlocking the dynamism of the services sector, and getting rid of those most noxious features of the new trade environment, non-tariff barriers. So I got 6, I probably took 10, but let me share one final thought. When I was first introduced to APEC, I was also introduced to the idea that sometimes the acronym is jokingly explained as a perfect excuse for conversation, which I had to think about for a minute, but that was what it was introduced to me as. But let me tell you that, like this conference itself, there literally has never been a more important time for that conversation to take place. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Ngā mihi, Rachel. Next up, we have someone who probably doesn't need an introduction, Fran O'Sullivan, the very prominent New Zealand journalist who's the op-ed columnist for the New Zealand Herald, writing primarily on political business and international affairs. And as many of us know, she's also the editor of Herald's Mood of the Boardroom report, which captures that annual mood by our chief executives. She MCs the annual debate between the finance minister and his opponent and oversees that influential survey. She particularly focuses on the linkages between government and business in New Zealand, the political personalities and how they impact on business decisions. Now, I've invited her to sit or stand as she wishes, and she will sit. Welcome.
It's all right, I've been on my feet quite a bit today. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm going to possibly take a somewhat impertinent approach to the topic. We're a year into the pandemic, nearly. We have yet, in my view, to see a coherent, demonstrable and efficacious roadmap for the future. And that concerns me a bit, quite a bit in fact. The speech from the throne, the Prime Minister made clear elimination is the strategy. That is also the strategy which is promoted to the world, and the border obviously is a fundamental part of that. But sprinkling money like confetti is a very short-term, unsustainable approach. So too a sole focus on eliminating the COVID-19 virus at the time when many of our trading partners are wanting to knock on our doors again, when there is overtures about wanting to get students through, and a pragmatic approach doesn't seem in sight for a good half year or more. So I think we need to learn to sing and tap dance at the same time, create safe pathways for investors, traders, essential workers outside of the bread and circuses, your America's Cup and so forth. The government promised 10% of MIQ places to commercial. We need to see that. 2,000 additional seasonal workers through the door from the Pacific. That's not going to stop a lot of our trade being affected. Rotten fruit left there, unpicked and unexported. This can only affect not only export crops, but send prices up internally. We are seeing the impact of supply chain crunch day after day, worsening. Headlines on this and the possibility also of the world's major airlines not incorporating New Zealand on their air routes again if the sealed border is too protracted. So I think if we're not careful, we have a looming supply crisis, which really gets to the fundamental of what trade is about. Trade, ladies and gentlemen, means getting stuff over and across borders at its most fundamental. And then there's the rules of the game, spoken to quite eloquently by my colleague, and the issues that lie ahead of us. But I think if we're talking, and I'm approaching this as a business journalist right now, the immediate 6 months or more, I think we really do need to get some fundamental issues addressed. The Prime Minister has shepherded in a range of new ministers who all have external-facing portfolios. I can't recall in my history as a journalist outside of a change of government where actually we've seen so many new people come to the table. We've lost a bit of continuity. On the one side, we don't have a coalition government being projected to the world where, you know, certain of those positions were held by the coalition partner. We ought to have more coherence as a result, but it's also possibly not enough challenge. There is no one in Cabinet challenging, for instance, when we should open our borders again. You will recall last year, Winston Peters and others making a big thing about getting open to the Pacific Islands, and particularly the Cook Islands, which actually is very relevant to their survival, not just for tourism, but also for trade. But tourism, of course, is trade and services, so think about it that way. The other issue, of course, is with Australia. Again and again, we have heard that this could happen. It's looking very much far out into the future. This, again, creates some issues for our economy. So, as someone put it to me the other day, we're like a grounded wide-body jet, and while 5 million passengers are shielded from the worst of COVID, if we're not careful, we will face higher unemployment in the future, have a debt burden which doesn't need to sustain for so long, and face falling prospects. So the jet must fly if New Zealand is not only to survive but thrive. And this relies on two wings: what we sell from the soil and the sea, and how well we can sell our smarts. There have been pockets of optimism through the business community. Those who initially saw an increase in business resulting from the crisis, such as shipping and logistics firms, they pointed out early that reduced commercial aviation meant more demand for their services. But now, as you've seen with what's happening on Auckland Port and Northport, we do have a massive bungle in Auckland. We are, I mean, it's diabolical, and frankly, there needs to be an action plan to sort this out, because we're going to have 100 containers being trucked up the highway from Northport back to Auckland as a result of the snafu. We have the instance of smaller firms who don't have the clout of Fonterra or Zespri, who don't have guaranteed arrangements with Maersk and the big shipping lines. Already there is talk of material being offloaded in places like Hawaii and just wait for something to come along someday to be loaded back on and get down to New Zealand. The talk from a number of people like get in now, buy your wash basins and stuff ahead of time, because actually the goods are not going to get here. Now that might be a bit exaggerated, some of it is anecdotal, and we're seeing more and more evidence of this looming crisis come out day by day. And this is an issue which the Herald is attacking, but trade is not just the architecture and the relationships, it's actually day-to-day management of a nation as well. So I think we've got some work to do there. One of the things we did do in that Mood of the Boardroom survey earlier in the year is we added an international risk section, and we kind of mirrored it. We normally do our own, but we actually mirrored it on the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which is another arm to APEC. It's tripartite, business, academia, and government officials acting in their own right. And we looked at that to see how New Zealand lined up, and it lines up pretty well. COVID was obviously the top-rated international concern, further waves of the virus, but slowdown in world trade due to fallout from the pandemic and supply chain issues. Well, that's taken a while to occur, but I would suggest that's landing on our doorstep now. The other issue was the lack of international leadership. And again, I think some of that was coloured by business, not just in New Zealand, but also throughout the region, the attitudes towards Donald Trump and the fact that he had acted to work against the international consensus over multilateralism. With Joe Biden, we may see a change. Omens are good around some of the international organisations being addressed appropriately by the president-elect. But there's also a challenge which is posed by US and China, and it's one New Zealand will have to navigate quite carefully as we go into the year of hosting APEC, where we will be the host in the middle, and we have a powerful position, but it's also a difficult position. I was at something earlier today where somebody, without its Chatham House rules, but I can say a Maori business leader, questioned, for instance, why we would be too quick to be on the bandwagon, Australia's bandwagon, in taking and sharing the concerns and outrage over the trolling by the spokesman in China over Scott Morrison and the issues that had happened there around the deaths incurred by Australian servicemen. And the point being was, well, you know, look back, our own history as a nation is born also on colonisation, it's born on not honouring agreements. So we need to tread very carefully in thinking through if other nations are getting, you know, antagonised, just what rhetoric we actually do buy into. Think about, do we have blind spots? And it does seem, looking out, that these areas can very quickly spark into an unnecessary crisis, and probably everyone needs to draw a breath around the region, and that again is a huge challenge for the policymakers and the hosts of APEC, I would suggest. Before I just skirt through some current issues, I just want to also note the Productivity Commission's Frontiers firm report, which came out today, and that found productivity of our frontier firms lagging some 50% behind overseas counterparts, and suggesting we need a new approach, in terms of small advanced economies, that we need to have a greater focus on exporting specialised products at scale to overcome our hurdles of distance and size, and a range of other things, more focused government investment and more policy and regulatory changes to support innovation. And this includes across issues like GM, which hitherto have been undiscussable issues in the last decade or so. However, it's a bit of a, coming back to the fundamental trade issues brewing for NZ Inc. as we come into the peak export season, and I did talk about that before, but Auckland is operating at less than half its crane capacity, and ports of Auckland are attributing this to a shortage of stevedores and also COVID and labour shortages. Well, if you were saying that, why wouldn't you say, for God's sake, can't we make these MIQ places available, go out there, get these people and pay them what they needed? Because if we are slow and so unproductive, some of these shipping lines are just going to give us a wide berth as well. So they are currently predicting guaranteed berth windows will be suspended until at least February next year. Increased costs across all elements of the supply chain are going up. Shipping lines are starting to put in place congestion charges for shippers using Auckland. This is the price point is somewhere around $500 to $600 US per 40-foot container. They're so far being paid forward by importers and exporters, but that's going to be passed on sooner or later. All the container terminals are now significantly less efficient because of the knock-on factor. And then there's the lack of latent capacity truck and rail networks as well. And that's, again, those 1,000 or so containers having to come down this weekend into Auckland from Northport. So these constraints and imports will see a consequential impact on getting our devanned empty boxes ready to be filled again. So as I said, the large exporters, Fonterra and Zespri, they do have arrangements put in place many years ago with Maersk. They'll be fine. And a number of the others have long-dated contracts with shipping lines. But smaller, high-value exporters, meat and fruit, typically take spot shipping prices. So they're going to face problems coming into the coming season. And this problem is also coming to bear in the South Island. So I think we do need to be aware that there are some immediate issues as well. And this comes down to trade policy, but also execution on trade policy and trade facilitation. Just as I said earlier, a warning, New Zealand is also vulnerable to flyby from other airlines when they prepare to relaunch next year. If we haven't given an indication when we will be allowing people through. There have been suggestions of, like Shanghai is doing now, just very limited, 3-day quarantines, that type of thing. We're going to need to start to do this stuff. Can't be a hermit kingdom forever. And I'll just pass quickly along to, excuse me, too many things here. So I do want to say, however, that our exporters have benefited from New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and the government funding flights to the region with perishable export goods, and also New Zealand Trade and Enterprise essentially having set up a global marketing arm where their people stand in the places of marketing reps from firms. But that can't go on forever. People do want face-to-face. We're seeing price pressures also increasing in other key markets, manufacturing in China, as I said before, many price increases there. And if you look to the United States, potentially there, looming food shortages. And that's because so many people are affected by COVID that they haven't been able to do what we've been lucky to do here, if in fact we'd opened the doors to get the people to do it. But anyway, it's a complex time. I think we need to see key business leaders in the room with government and an action agenda done, not a conversation, actually an action agenda. I think there's huge opportunities ahead for next year, particularly with the hosting of APEC and APEC and the CEO Summit. But I think we need to tidy up things pretty fast to avert a crisis.
Thank you, Fran. Our last speaker on the panel is Pamela Ford, who many of you will know. She's the General Manager of Economic Development at Auckland Unlimited, which has just come into being and is the result of a fruitful marriage between ATED and Regional Facilities Auckland. I think last week, was it? This week. So that's brand new. Her new position was with ATED and is now with Auckland Unlimited. She's a senior leader with an enormous experience leading diverse teams, driving economic development, investment attraction and international business in Auckland and in other cities. She's highly regarded as a strategic relationship builder across government with investors, business and NGOs, and we're very grateful that she agreed to join the panel at very short notice. So, Pamela Ford.
Inga mana, inga reo, e ro rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Pamela Ford aho. Thank you, Damon. And I tell you what, I got a call about an hour and a half ago from my friend Caroline asking if I'd help up my friend Jennifer. And of course I said yes, but I didn't realise I'd be following such wonderful woman that I admire greatly, Rachel, who I was working with nearly 20 years ago when she was the Dynamo in Los Angeles as the Trade Commissioner, and of course Fran, who I hold in very high regard and esteem. So lovely to hear you speak. Look, I'll talk about what I know a little bit about, which is the Auckland context. As Damon has said, it's beautiful to be in this whale. I feel very at ease. I'm usually here for book launches and wonderful ceremonies like that. So it's a beautiful place to have a conference, and well done for having it here. Auckland Unlimited was formed on the 1st of December, which was, I think, Tuesday. We had our joining together on Wednesday morning, which was a wonderful ceremony. And the whole idea of bringing together the Economic Development Agency and the cultural and facilities aspect of the city is really to try and become a really committed to making Auckland the desired place to live, work, do business and invest. And it's come at what I thought during COVID around July time when it was looking likely, like why would you put a merger on top of everything else that we've been trying to do in terms of recovery? But as we go into 2021, I think it's a really good action for this region to have a bigger, more regenerative kind of agency with a new way of doing things. So if we look at Auckland in context of the rest of the country, the message that I'm always saying to particularly our officials in Wellington and ministers, and certainly our international people that are here today, that Auckland is different to the rest of the country in that we are a region of regions. We have a very young population, we have a very diverse population, 220 ethnicities, And as Damon said, we are the Pacifica capital of the world. And so in terms of our economic makeup or our economic demographic, we are the commercial driver of the country. We are not built on a pastoral economy. We are the financial services hub. We have 50% of New Zealand's technology industry here and 50% of our creative industries here, very disproportionate to the rest of the country. So while we very big in those ways, the way that COVID has hit us tremendously is the fact that our whole biggest sectors were obviously international education, and I see Jenny is here, and tourism. And the impact on those two sectors, particularly on our city centre, have been unbelievably massive. So we've had one lockdown that we all went through. We had the second lockdown that only Auckland went through. And then we had the sneeze on November the 13th when we were told to keep away from the city centre. And the impact on that is still being felt across the city centre, in that the confidence, the impact on retail, the impact on the rest of the country not wanting to come to Auckland. So even our domestic tourism efforts have been a bit thwarted. What ATED at that time, what we've been looking at is how can we use our convening power to really address those issues that are different for Auckland to the rest of the country to Wellington. And so called up Fran in July and said, Fran, we need to get all of business together. We convened about 200 business leaders and directors on August the 5th, just up the road. And what came out of that was 5 actions that we're focusing on. Managed isolation was number 1. So what Fran's saying about the border is absolutely vital to all of New Zealand, obviously, but really, really felt here, and none more so for our international education friends. But we have brought together a private steering group. We have been trying to corral those voices. We have done economic analysis, and we are wanting to have an engagement with central government around what is the roadmap, because it is the numbers which I would normally have in my head, but having had a week like this and not having prepared, I don't have them all flying. But the numbers are really compelling around the not having a roadmap around managed isolation. And so we were very hopeful around the 10% for non-residents coming into play, and we are taking that up. We have investors wanting to come in through America's Cup who have billions of dollars to unlock. We know the investor migrants that are sitting on the shelf, 600 people with billions of dollars, through to obviously our students, our health workers. So on the health sector in Auckland is our biggest employer, and we're not able to even get critical workers. So what we're doing is really trying to focus on managed isolation, because that will unlock a lot of what we need to enable our trade to take place. The other area that we're putting a lot of focus on is the impact on South and West Auckland. So we know from the GFC and other economic recessions that the impact on our young people, our Maori and our Pacifica populations and our women take a lot longer to come back and play. And so a really deep dive, and the time is now. We say to ourselves, a bit like Rachel said, how can we be a good ancestor out of a crisis like this to the people that really will be most affected? And so we are looking at what are some transformative projects and plays over the 10, 15 and beyond periods that we can put in place that are really going to be good for our people. You might say, what the heck's this got to do with trade and economic policy? Is we are looking at how we can build those fundamental structures that will bring more investment, allow more two-way trade, and grow some new industries, whether it be into food and beverage, plant protein, how we build our digital and tech. We've decided we're going to go hard on technology, not just as an enabler, but also how we could become a real creative tech capital of Asia Pacific. So I feel like I might be starting to rave now, which is not good for any of you. But my key point, I guess, is Auckland, you are looking at policy, whether it's trade and economic or whatever, the conditions in this region, the largest region at 38% of GDP, the very interesting, diverse region with some high needs, it is a region that has to be looked at differently, and it's something that we were very engaged in about a year ago when APEC were talking about the agenda for next year, and that emphasis on digital trade is super, super important. And I just plea that this is something that we, as an Auckland region, are very interested in pursuing over the next 12 months. And with that, I just want to wish Rachel and the APEC team the best of everything over the next 12 months as you head into APEC, and obviously all of MFAT as we prepare for our wonderful virtual conference and spotlight on Tamaki Makaurau and New Zealand next year. Thank you.
Whawhatai, Pamela. I'm going to just add a few things, and I'm sort of channeling Colin here, or maybe not. Maybe I'm saying what I want to say. I'm saying Colin would say it, but I guess I'm really appreciative of all the comments that have come through. And I wanted to perhaps pitch a story which will be appreciated by many at MFAT, but less so by New Zealanders at large around New Zealand's trade context, which is that there are two New Zealands. There are two formal definitions of New Zealand. One is the New Zealand we actually think of, typically in public conversation, that what's known actually legally as New Zealand proper. So that's the North Island, South Island, Stewart Island and the Chathams. But there's another entity constitutionally of which is known as the realm of New Zealand. And that realm stretches as far north as Tauleilei. And if we begin with the northernmost part of New Zealand, Tauleilei, and we reimagine the context of New Zealand knowing that our nearest neighbour is Samoa to our south, it becomes an entirely different proposition about our context in the world. When I'm talking to students, there's a kind of pivotal moment, and it's actually in December, around where New Zealand had to re-recognise its place in the world, and that December was in 1941. In November 1941, New Zealanders imagined that the existential threat to New Zealand was somewhere in eastern or western Poland, maybe in Belgium or France. But on the 7th of December, and rolling through the 10th, when Force Z was sunk off Singapore, New Zealanders came to realise that they are and will always be in the Pacific, and that the existential threats to New Zealand will come from the Pacific. And what we heard across the panels today was that a lot of what's happening in New Zealand in terms of trade and our diplomacy and the thinking through who we are and what we wish to be is coming to terms with that in fundamental ways. That countries like China are nearer to us and matter to us in ways that distant nations might not. We know that we are one of many nations whose chief trade relations, whose number one trading partner, sits across the table with largely different values and a distant history from us. And that increasingly we're having to confront this as a deep challenge to our own values. Where will things like trade and partnership sit in times where our chief economic partner shares perhaps far less things with us than there has been in the case in the past? And so that issue haunts so much of what we do in Auckland and in the Pacific. And we know, for instance, that so much of what guides our economic policy in the Pacific is actually our diplomacy, which sits almost at an opposite of what guides our diplomacy elsewhere, where trade leads the way and diplomacy is almost like a handmaiden. I know that's blunt, but that's an observation we might sit with, because our actions in the Pacific, our thoughts around the future of our region, our relationships, and actually our values drive this home. And some of what has come up is the way that these questioning of values and the value of our trade have actually led us to turn also inwards, so that many of our trading relationships and our diplomacy has turned to places in New Zealand where it hasn't turned. We have a foreign minister that looks unlike any minister we've had before, who mobilises a whakapapa and a subjectivity that is at odds with what has happened before. I like to point out that Nanaia has a relationship with the Pacific that precedes and exceeds any relationship that comes via the New Zealand state. She will be recognised in ways that are due to her whakapapa and her place, particularly in the kingitanga, and not just because of her title as our foreign minister. So we're confronting these things on a daily basis. We're asking these questions, and we're also having to realise that in a COVID context, as Fran has pointed out, where the border closure to the world has also been a border closure to parts of the world which do not have COVID. And that those places are perhaps the most affected by our policies. It's not most of the times we reflect on our impact of our border closures, but these border closures, of course, are extraordinarily impactful. And as New Zealand imagines itself as an ethical and rules-led player in the world, it's often worthwhile to reflect on how others see us who actually are often downstream from our decision-making. And although we like to see ourselves in this way, that is not always the way we are seen in the Pacific. And certainly we fret about the 11% or so of our GDP that's caught up in tourism, but we're looking at Pacific economies north of 20%, some as high as perhaps 30%. Extraordinary numbers, and that's without taking into effect the real drivers of these economies, which is actually those Pacific people living in New Zealand who return home, the visiting friends and relatives, as they're called statistically. This offers us a really different context and also allows us to reflect, I think, on something we all discovered. When the RSE scheme was first floated in New Zealand, it was floated as an aid policy. That is, we were reaching out and doing something for the Pacific. Now, I was one of the few that's always been critical of this policy, partly because of what it does in terms of human mobility. Shuts off that pathway to residency and citizenship that brought people like my father to New Zealand. But what we've discovered under COVID is actually that RSE it's not aid to the Pacific as much as it is aid to New Zealand's regions and New Zealand's own economy. And the question of reopening the borders has become less about those workers who can come here and more about the desperate need for these people. And actually, it's also a point of reflection where New Zealand has proceeded down a path where it has sought to pursue a path of separating people's labour from their persons. That is, they come and work for a time and then they return. Actually models for those of you, and American people have commented this to me, it looks a lot like the Braceros program in California for also picking fruit, which has been roundly criticised by scholars ever since. So with those questions, which hopefully to circle around all that we have and come back to these questions of Indigenous economies and what they can contribute to new ways of thinking, innovation, and delivering truly ethical economic and trade policy, I will once again thank our panelists, and I will open the floor because we still have a little bit of time. And we have our first question. If you could wait for the microphone.
Kia ora everyone, I'll stand. My name is George, I'm from MFAT, one of those Yo Pros. Rachel, you mentioned Chinese Taipei, and I'm the coordinator for the ANZEC agreement, which is between New Zealand and Chinese Taipei. And in that agreement, we have Chapter 19. And Chapter 19 was I'm not going to give you a TED talk about it, but essentially, it enables our cultural and economic links between their Council for Indigenous Peoples and Te Puni Kōkiri. And so through that, you can have Taiwanese Indigenous peoples and New Zealand Maori having a range of cultural links, both cultural and economic and people-to-people links. So, Rachel, I really want to get your opinion. In this new trade environment and with the opportunities we have with the disruption from COVID, what do you think the future for Indigenous links, particularly within the trade context, would look like? And to be frank, do you have any recommendations? Because I'm all ears.
Always recommendations. Well, recommendations about how to jump it?
So I suppose recommendations about what would be innovative and also meaningful Indigenous links, particularly given the opportunity we have with COVID disrupting things and giving us a blank canvas of sorts.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So with regards to that agreement specifically. I'm not sure it's entirely being utilised as well as it could or should be at the moment. However, we do have the Tina Wilson, who is at NZTE now. She's going up there in about 2 weeks' time to take on the role as Trade Commissioner, so I suspect you'll see some movement on that front. She currently leads the Maori team at NZTE, so she's going to be a fantastic resource for us up there. I think that you are really starting to see Indigenous communities reach out to each other at exponentially faster pace and deeper, more meaningful ways. And the reason why, my perspective on this is that we have unlimited potential. That's a starting point for me in and around Indigenous economies. And what I believe is happening is we are growing into our capabilities quickly because we have to. And if you look at the Maori version of that, it's because we're now in a post-settlement, like most of us are in a post-settlement era where it's gone from a time of grievance and negotiation through to now optimism and opportunity. So what do you do with that? And so, and it doesn't happen, well, it did happen overnight in a sense, but it's taken a long time to get there, and you come out the other side of it and you have a whole group of people who are very risk adverse and who are slightly battered by the experience, but ready to go because it's a burning platform and they need to make the most of the opportunities that present themselves. And so one of the first places that they will look is to people who look and feel like them around the world. And so I think that as we all grow into our potential and build our capability and our capacity to scale businesses and reach out and have meaningful interactions with other Indigenous economies, you'll start to see that move, as I say, more at greater pace and to greater depths. So I think my advice on that front is to really start to better understand the most developed Indigenous economies, where they are, what they're looking for, where the match might be, because there are people who are doing it in different ways. And last year we sent a group from Wakatu Incorporation, who owns Kono, and we sent a group from Wakatu to Peru to understand the conversations that were being had there about intellectual property as it pertains to their potatoes. You know, it was quite specific, but it's the way in, because that is what's most valuable to them. But it is a question of IP, knowing it, valuing it, protecting it, strengthening yourselves before you invite other people back into that conversation.
Other questions?
Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou for your great presentation. I love a Widow Challenge from Fran to policymakers. It's always wonderful. I had a question about health cooperation in the ATEPS and the APEC context, both to protect us against future pandemics and also to get people moving once we are vaccinated. I think for a lot of business people, the most well-known thing APEC has ever done is the travel card, because it got you to China without a visa. Could we have a vaccination card or something like that? I mean, just to get us going.
Well, I understand that's one of the things the Prime Minister endorses, some sort of international card, which actually does contain your vaccination details. It's a moot point whether that will be required, obviously, for people to come through our border as well, and which particular vaccines might be deemed the right ones. So China has different ones, for instance, to Pfizer, and other US ones created by Operation Warp Speed. So yeah, I think we are going to see that. And also airlines like Qantas, for instance, has made it clear that they will not accept people once they relaunch internationally in a major way unless there is proof of vaccination. Would you like to talk?
Questions?
Kia ora, my name's Anna Woods. I work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Pacific team. I just wanted, it's more of an observation rather than a question, but Damon, I just wanted to thank you for reminding us of the realm. I think it's actually something I didn't even sort of know existed before I came to MFAT, which I think is a bit of an indictment on the way we educate New Zealanders about the realm. But yeah, I think something I've learned over the last year of working on the Pacific is I guess the big fish status we have in the Pacific compared to the kind of little fish status we have around the rest of the world, and the fact that what we do in the Pacific is incredibly meaningful, particularly, you know, for economic, as well as the work we do in development. And so yeah, I just really appreciated you reminding us of the effect, the disproportionate effect that we have, and I can testify to the fact that the people I work with, we were very much considering how New Zealand's domestic policy was going to affect the Pacific, particularly around the time of the COVID policies and all of that stuff. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. And the mischievous person in me has to say, I said this at one of the celebrations for MFAT, and I had the good grace to not put it in the book that they published, but actually MFAT itself is a direct descendant from New Zealand's colonial department, from what was then called External Affairs. And so that legacy is built into our state structures. I mean, by the 1930s in New Zealand had almost as many Polynesians under New Zealand colonial control north of Rienga than as south of it. And the fact that we have these legacy elements within MFAT, where you have the administrative tokelao within that group is one of those things that I think we have to confront head on to really deal with these larger questions about the New Zealand state and its place in the Pacific. So I thank you for that. You can fix that from inside.
Thank you. My name is Sima, and I'm representing the Tuvalu High Commission in Wellington. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for your presentations and also for the opportunity for us to attend this conference. Mine is just not a question, but also a comment and observation, or maybe just information sharing. First of all, I'd like to thank that I finally get to see the CEO of Kono, which employs Tuvaluans at the moment. And really thank you and appreciate for having our workers here, especially during this time of COVID, well looked after. So my comment goes just to share information that there are processes in the Pacific that exist that usually smaller than APEC, but we have the Pacific Islands Forum, where Tuvalu is currently the chair. And we also have the informal setting process called the Polynesian Leaders grouping. And Tuvalu, and I think American Samoa is about to take over the chairing. So my point is that, yes, please, New Zealand, do look into the Pacific. We always bring this issue up during these forums on trying to get a stronger Pacific, or we have other processes or issues such as the Blue Pacific on trying to have a strong Pacific. And like you mentioned, there are external threats to New Zealand that your neighbors in the Pacific, such as Tuvalu, Cook Islands, Fiji, Samoa, can help in us in moving forward with this ongoing tug of war that's happening between these two superpowers. So I'd just like to share just some food for thought from a small island state such as Tuvalu. And we hope that we can move forward with the border restrictions, as we have a lot of Tuvaluans who are willing to come over and work in the RSC going forward. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's really, really lovely to see you, and we do have our it was the first year ever that we had a team come over from Tuvalu, and it was really amazing, and I just really have a lot of aroha for them because it was the first time, and they've been here since August of last year, and they were hoping to go home in May, and they obviously haven't. So yeah, they're definitely a part of our whānau now. We love having them with us, but it's really tough. I recognise that first time away doing the work that they're doing, the program that they're doing, to have been here for such a long time. So we're definitely looking after them.
I might just add too that one of the issues that comes up, which has always been a trouble for New Zealand, is that the Pacific Islands Forum has always put security at the top of its list. And the number one security concern in the Pacific has been climate change. And so, that's been the issue where the New Zealand has seen security very differently to Pacific nations. And that whenever trade talks have come up, including in PESA Plus and others, the number one question for Pacific nations has been labour mobility, which has not really been what New Zealand has been about, apart from RSC. So, you know, that disalignment between Pacific leadership and New Zealand leadership has been, you know, growing over the years, and I think, you know, we see that under Tuvalu's leadership as well. Thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, all of you. I just have a question for Pam. I really enjoyed the centering of your talk on Auckland. I think it's really easy for Wellington to forget about Auckland, and given we have so many Wellingtonians in the audience, we may as well make that point. And I also really appreciated your shout out about international education as a service. So we're in this place and we are another sector that is struggling at the moment, and there is no roadmap for that one either. So underscoring Pam. But I just wondered if you, Fran, I just wondered if you might expand a little bit more on the creative tech that you mentioned, because sometimes I think when people think Auckland, they think the America's Cup or the Women's Rugby World Cup maybe, and forget that there has already been work in creative tech that's been going on, and that is this an opportunity with the renewed focus on digital economies and so on for creative tech to take off?
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, so creative technologies is a sector I'm very passionate about, and just been briefing our new board members today, and the comparison I made was we've got Amazon here creating the largest television series ever in the world for the next 10 years, fingers crossed everything goes okay, and the GDP contribution from that is about 2.5 billion times. So it's 3 at the lowest, maybe 5 times the value of an America's Cup, yeah? So people don't know that, and there's 2,300 people working right now today out at the studio. And these are not film stars, although there are some stars, and I see Sir Lenny Henry was named today as one of the new cast, and looking at the new cast, and my partner who's Fijian is an extra early next year as well. It seems like they're having quite a few people of colour, which is awesome in the Tolkien world for this new one. Anyway, that's by the by. The importance of the creative technology sector for all of Aotearoa, but for Auckland in particular, it ticks so many boxes. It's part of the green economy. It's a weightless export. It's a really great career pathway for our rangatahi, and particularly for our Maori and Pacifica people. In Auckland, it's focused in West Auckland and South Auckland, which are areas of focus. There are the barriers to trade are not so bad as some other places, obviously, or not, more accessible, although we want to create more. I know EduTech is an area that's been wanting to get much more access to different markets that they're cut out of at the moment. So we see huge potential for creative tech. We just opened a co-working hub out in Mount Albert this week as well, on Wednesday night, I think. And so the ability to, employ a lot of people, employ a lot of ancillary businesses. So for the film and television series, we've got Netflix here at the moment, we've got Warner Brothers. We are the biggest production base for the country. You also employ food, you employ fashion, makeup, carpenters, and all of those sorts of people. And then we have this really wonderful domestic production base here too, which are telling our own stories. So the emphasis on being able to tell our Pacifica stories, our Maori stories, and take them out to the world is really, really important. So we've been wanting to work much more, and we are working much more with Ministry of Culture Heritage and MB. It's another sector that kind of gets slipped between the cracks, in that, is it an MB, is it an MCH, where does MFAT come in, and all of those. But creative tech is the future, and last Friday I was up at Rocketworks, which is a gaming company, which was bought by Tencent for about over 100 million, wasn't it, Fran? They're on the 37th floor of the PwC building in Commercial Bay. So who would have thought a gaming company in New Zealand would have the top floor of the biggest building in the city? It's just amazing. And they, during lockdown, they employed 65 new people on top of the other 200 they've got. 60 of those people were New Zealanders. So there's a lot of potential in that sector.
I might just ask Fran a question. So you mentioned that you would like government and business leaders to come up with an action agenda. If Fran was coming up with the action agenda, what would be on it?
Yeah, throw it back at me. Well, I think first things first, they, I was going to say reinvent the New Zealand shipping line at times. Does seem that that's something that may have been short-sighted in a year, and when we're thinking about globalisation, I do think that there needs to be meetings with the major shipping lines. I do think it needs to be government and business together. We have, people obviously like Don Braid and others who are saying this is not just a local issue, it's also international, the movement of, global logistics. But however, it's our own neck of the woods. What do we do? How do we bring something down to New Zealand if it's stuck in Honolulu? We need to think that out. I mean, does some stuff need to be freighted? Does some stuff I guess you can't barge it down, but possibly celestial voyages might be able to do that. But, I think there's, they've got to talk for a start. I mean, everyone's about to go on holiday and we've got this huge issue here. Big thing, I think, got to bring in those stevedores, unlock the nonsense on Auckland Port. If it's a shortage of labour, shortage of talented people, make it a priority. Elevate them up the queue, What else has been snaffled? Anyway, that was my first thing, is actually unlock the stranglehold first. Get a sense of which are the smallest enterprises who are going to be affected, pull them all together, create synergies, create, a large order book together. And so you've got sufficient clout so you can go to market. Very hard if everyone's doing it individually. So I really do think it's a major issue. But that's just off the top of the head.
Pamela's going to add to the Fran list.
Fran mentioned it before, but that threat, we look at the impact on us as a country, but it seems quite siloed. So one of the threats that we're worried about at the moment is the impact of Australia. So Australia is taking our workers, that are working on the horticultural places, they're taking our construction workers, just as we're about to go into the biggest phase of construction and infrastructure spend. They're opening their doors to investors. So the plane loads, once planes get back up, and if we're not open, we're going to lose those access points. That threat of other nations taking our place is one that we're very cognizant of.
Thank you guys for taking the time out today. My name is Ash and I'm one of the lucky 2 attendees from Asia Business Foundation. Outside of the foundation, my work is being a credit analyst. I work for Westpac, and the education sector is one of the sectors I look at. And I guess my question is going to be forming around how do we export successfully and getting all the students coming in, but then have the sort of migration policies right settings, because at the moment there is a disconnect between the two. People come here, whether it's for ITPs, the mainstream universities, whatever it may be, but then the struggle to get through the next round, because they are sold the story overseas. And you say that a lot in West Auckland. I'm a Westie, and a lot of the community work I've done, you do realise that people are sort of struggling because they got this picture and then the government changed, policies changed, and now they're sort of stuck in between a very hard place to navigate through. So do you really believe that we can still sell this, whether it's education, whatever sector it is, without having a good, solid, sort of not very nimble policy with migration? Because that's the issue that we're seeing right now in the communities.
Look, I'd just like to talk to a point that I was just thinking about. It might be a bit tangential, but we do have an issue because of the border, and that issue is often a number of people who work in our companies. They, have a friend who runs a Chinese bank here. She has workers who can't go home because they can't get back in again. You know, it's going to take too long either which way, and they worry that they won't be able to get back in again because they're not an essential worker in the government's sense of it. You know, they're not a New Zealander. So you're actually starting to see a number of working teams who are thinking about going home. I've just seen the other day a friend of mine who's marketing manager at Sky. She's going back to Adelaide. I've got other friends going back to France, and that's because they've been away too long. They're prepared to take the risk of going back to more COVID in their own country, and they know that they're not going to be able to get back in because they're not New Zealanders and they're not on a 10% list of VIPs, if you like. And so this is something starting to bubble up in companies right across New Zealand. We've had people who are, major executives in banks based here who can't come. Real problems mentioned in the construction industry, absolutely a big one. And all of those people have been hammering on the government's doors now for months. In our survey earlier in the year, we had a section on construction, we had a section on infrastructure and one on agribusiness, and they were all under pressure. So, I mean, this is a major issue.
Yeah, and combining that and your point, and I think, Rachel, you said something at our Maori Economic Summit last week about this. The time is now to make some transformative changes around policy, and migration, immigration should be one of those. We have to think differently about, because our whole labour supply is different, and all of the threats are quite different to what we've thought in the past. So we need to, that's why I make the point, recognise that parts of Auckland are different, that Wellington needs to take a really good look. What's happening at the top of the South Island, what's happening in Auckland, what's happening in areas, and then adjust policies to think of that bigger picture.
So I might make the last comment. We've run out of time, but the last comment really, because we are at the University of Auckland, and of course this is very important to us, and we're experiencing difficulties ourselves due to the closure of the border. That's an open knowledge, and I think we're nervous about the changing of settings in that field. We're just as Pamela was saying, we're in an extraordinarily competitive international market as the University of Auckland. We're not just competing with Otago, we're competing with Sydney, with BC, so for us, and we know how important that is. I think it's the 4th largest export industry in New Zealand education, so incredibly important. So the border issues, making sure that we have the right settings to attract these people, and of course we have things at the university that we couldn't sustain in any other ways in a nation like New Zealand. I think particularly of the Auckland Bioengineering Institute, which is attracting hundreds of the world's most talented young people from across the planet to come to Auckland and do things that frankly can't be done elsewhere. So absolutely we need to get the things right, but I guess there's nervousness around messing with some of the things that have made us attractive, and I'm very conscious that the head of our international education is sitting over at the table there, our Deputy Vice-Chancellor International, Strategic Engagement. So with that, I know there was one more question, but we are at time, and this is time to take a break. I just wanted to thank our panellists once again, Rachel, Fran and Pam, and ask us to give them another hand. And I think